Hello, everyone, and welcome to this online event organized by the Embassy of Greece to celebrate the International Greek Language Day. I would like to thank you all for joining us today on Zoom, also those who are watching our live streaming on Facebook. This event is being recorded and it will soon be available through our social media channels. If you wish to post on social media during the event, please use hashtags International Greek Language Day and Greece 2021. You can see those in our chat section as well. Also in the chat, you will find the famous Olata speeches that he delivered in English using Greek words only. If you have any questions, you can use the Q&A button and our panelists will answer as many questions as possible during the Q&A section. Today, we have the honor and the great pleasure to have here with us the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Konstantinos Vlasis. Before giving the floor to the Minister, we will begin this event with a recorded video that was actually his initiative. This year, we decided to celebrate the International Greek Language Day by asking people around the world, why do you learn Greek? Let's hear what they say and also a message by the Prime Minister, Kyriakos Mitsotakis.
Ελληνικά, επειδή είμαι Έλληνας και αγαπώ την Ελλάδα.
Μαθαίνω ελληνικά για να μιλάω επί οικογένεια μου στην Ελλάδα.
Γιατί είναι η μητέρα όλων των γλωσσών.
Για να μάθω την ταυτότητα του ελληνικού λαού.
Είμαι Αργεντίνος, αλλά έχω ελληνικό αίμα.
Είμαι περήφανη που μιλάω την ελληνική γλώσσα και συνεχίζω την παράδοση των προπούτων μου.
Για να παίζουμε τα ξαδερφάκια μου.
Για να με καταλαβαίνουν όλοι στην Κύπρο.
Γιατί θέλω να μάθω ελληνική ιστορία. Γιατί είναι δικιά μου γλώσσα και θέλω να την μάθω καλά.
Για να μπορώ να βλέπω ελληνικές ταινίες.
Μου αρέσουν οι αποχρώσεις της ελληνικής γλώσσας.
Είναι μέρος της ψυχής μου.
Να μάθω για όλα τα έθιμα της Ελλάδας.
Για να μαθαίνω ελληνικά στις φίλες μου στο εξωτερικό. Γιατί είναι η γλώσσα της καρδιάς μου.
Η ελληνική γλώσσα είναι βαθιά στην καρδιά μου.
Θέλω να καταλάβω πιο καλά τους προγόνους μου.
Μου αρέσουν τα γλώσσα, τα φαγητά και βέβαιος να ταξιδεύω στην Ελλάδα.
Μαθαίνω ελληνικά γιατί στο χωριό μου στην Πάρο ελληνικά μιλάω.
Βγαίνω στην Ελλάδα κάθε χρόνο.
Τη λατρεύω και τη θεωρώ σαν την αγαπημένη μου χώρα.
Μας αρέσει η Ελλάδα πάρα πολύ. Ως Ευρωπαίος αισθάνομαι λίγο Έλληνας.
Γιατί είναι μια ιστορία αγάπης.
Γιατί είναι πλούσια, ακριβή, σπουδική, περιγραφική, βιβλική, ονειρική, αναδική.
Επειδή αγαπάμε την Ελλάδα και τα ελληνικά.
Τα ελληνικά είναι η γλώσσα του Ομήρου και του Αριστοτέλη, αλλά και η γλώσσα του Σεφέρη και του Ελίτη, αφετηρία της ιστορίας και του πολιτισμού. Πηξίδα του σήμερα και φάρος του μέλλοντος. Μια γέφυρα πάνω από σύνορα που αγκαλιάζει τον κόσμο. Γι' αυτό μαθαίνουμε ελληνικά. Για να μιλάμε και να νιώθουμε ελληνικά.
That was our video, and now it is time to welcome the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Konstantinos Vlasis. Since we celebrate the International Greek Language Day, both the Prime Minister and the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs are addressing their messages in Greek. Κύριε Υπουργέ.
Κύριε Πρέσβη, αγαπητοί καθηγητές και καθηγήτριες, αγαπητοί φίλοι, θα ήθελα αρχικά να συγχαρώ τον πρέσβη της Ελλάδας στο Ηνωμένο Βασίλειο, κύριο Ιωάννη Ραπτάκη, για την πρωτοβουλία της σημερινής εκδήλωσης με θέμα Greek Revolution, Greek Language Revolution, που πραγματοποιείται στο πλαίσιο των εορτασμών τόσο της Παγκόσμιας ημέρας ελληνικής γλώσσας, όσο και των 200 χρόνων από την έναρξη της Ελληνικής Επανάστασης. Dear Ambassador, honorable professors, dear friends, it is a great pleasure for me to address this event, and I would like to thank Ambassador Raptakis for the kind invitation. As the pandemic challenges us in every aspect of our daily life and does not give us the chance to get together in person, technology offers us the opportunity to gather digitally. We feel honored today that distinguished professors and members of the British Academia are participating in this event, an event which highlights the universal acceptance of Greek as the language which first codified universal notions and laid the foundations for many key concepts of the Western civilization. In this spirit, and as Deputy Minister representing the Hellenic government in this event, I would kindly ask for your understanding to deliver this greet in Greek. Κατά τον εορτασμό των 200 χρόνων από την έναρξη της Ελληνικής Επανάστασης, αποτείουμε φόρο τιμής, όχι μόνο στην ανδρεία των αγωνιστών και στην επιμονή τους να φέρουν εις πέρας μια αποστολή που εκείνη τη χρονική στιγμή φαινόταν ακατόρθωτη. Η δίψα των Ελλήνων για ελευθερία και οι σπουδαίες παρακαταθήκες του ελληνικού πολιτισμού συγκίνησαν την Ευρώπη και σμιλεύοντας το φιλελληνικό κίνημα οδήγησαν στη δυναμική υποστήριξη των δικαίων των ξεσηκωμένων Ελλήνων. Η Μεγάλη Βρετανία υπήρξε μια εκ των χωρών που στήριξαν τα δίκαια και αυτές τις αξίες, συμβάλλοντας ουσιαστικά στον εθνικό αγώνα. Χαρακτηριστικά, μπορούμε να αναφερθούμε στη δημιουργία της Φιλελληνικής Επιτροπής του Λονδίνου, η οποία συστάθηκε τον Μάρτιο του 1823 με κύριο σκοπό την υποστήριξη της Ελληνικής Επανάστασης, αλλά και στον μεγάλο αριθμό καταγεγραμμένων Βρετανών φίλων της Ελλάδας, μεταξύ των οποίων ξεχωριστή θέση στην ιστορία κατέχει ο Λόρδος Βύρωνας. Δεν λησμονούμε επίσης την συμβολή της Μεγάλης Βρετανίας τόσο στο διπλωματικό όσο και στο πολεμικό πεδίο, με την ναυμαχία του Ναβαρίνου να καταγράφεται ως καθοριστικό σημείο στην πορεία του αγώνα για τη δημιουργία του ελληνικού κράτους, που έλαβε τελικώς σάρκα και οστά με την υπογραφή του Πρωτοκόλλου Ανεξαρτησίας πάλι στο Λονδίνο στις 3 Φεβρουαρίου του 1830. Κυρίες και κύριοι, με την ιδιότητά μου ως Υφυπουργός Εξωτερικών αρμόδιος για τον απόδημο ελληνισμό, έρχομαι καθημερινά σε επαφή τόσο με ομογενείς που διαβιούν στο εξωτερικό, όσο και με ξένους πολίτες που συνδέονται με την Ελλάδα με δεσμούς αγάπης για τη γλώσσα, τις παραδόσεις και τον πολιτισμό της. Έχω ως εκ τούτου προσωπική εμπειρία αφενός της ανάγκης των Ελλήνων του εξωτερικού να διατηρήσουν άσβεστη την ελληνική παιδεία, αφετέρου δε της δίψας των αλλοδαπών πολιτών να εντρυφήσουν στον ελληνικό πολιτισμό μέσω της εκμάθησης της ελληνικής. Σήμερα η ελληνική γλώσσα διδάσκεται και από ξένους καθηγητές σε πανεπιστήμια σε όλον τον κόσμο και η σημερινή εκδήλωση, στην οποία έχουν κληθεί να μιλήσουν επιφανείς Βρετανοί καθηγητές, είναι ένα τέτοιο παράδειγμα. Αγαπητοί φίλοι, ζείτε και εργάζεστε στη Μεγάλη Βρετανία. Μια φίλη χώρα, με την οποία η Ελλάδα διατηρεί άριστες διπλωματικές σχέσεις. Παρά τις αντίξωες συνθήκες που βιώνουμε όλοι μας εξαιτίας της πανδημίας, οι Βρετανοί πολίτες συνέχισαν και κατά το δύσκολο 2020 να επισκέπτονται τη χώρα μας. Εύχομαι το 2021, έτος σταθμό για την ελληνική ιστορία, να αποτελέσει την απαρχή εξόδου από την πανδημία, ώστε οι φιλέλληνες όλου του κόσμου να μπορέσουν να ξαναγευτούν τους καρπούς του ελληνικού πολιτισμού στη γενέτειρά του. Κύριε Πρέσβη, αγαπητέ φίλε Γιάννη Ραπτάκη, θερμά συγχαρητήρια για την πρωτοβουλία σας και καλή επιτυχία στην εκδήλωση. Congratulations once again to Ambassador Raptakis. I wish we have a fruitful discussion. Thank you. Ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Thank you, Minister. Next, we have a welcome message by the Ambassador of Greece in the United Kingdom, Mr. Ioannis Raptakis.
Good afternoon. I'm delighted to welcome you to this online event to honor the International Greek Language Day. I feel particularly honored that we had a message by the Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis. And of course, Mr. Vlasis, who is always extremely supportive to the needs and requests of the Greeks in the UK, and he's, I have to confess, the driving force behind the digitalization of most of the embassy services, the intelligent assistant, Moveo, the platform, My Consul Live, just to name a few. Thank you, Minister, once again. Today's event is part of the celebrations for the 200 years since the Greek Revolution. The 200-year anniversary is an opportunity to look back to our origins, to reflect more into our older and modern history. It is an opportunity to attempt a gaze at the horizon for the future with a sense of pride and responsibility. The Greek language, the main element of Hellenism, runs a trajectory reaching back thousands of years and continues to the present day. It traverses the Minoan and Mycenaean civilization, classic antiquity, the times of Alexander the Great, Byzantium, and reaches to us today. It is definitely the most important evidence of unbroken continuity of the Greek nation. It is the language of Homer and Aristotle. It is the language of Nobel laureates, Elitis and Seferis. It is the language of Xenophon Zolotas, who in the late 50s gave 2 speeches in English, using exclusively Greek words to emphasize the wealth of the Greek language and the fact that countless Greek words enrich English. This year, we do not just celebrate the International Greek Language Day. We celebrate what could be called an ancient language in the services of a modern cause. We honor the language of great men of literature, such as Dionysius Solomos, Andreas Kalvos, who spent a great part of his life in England, and of course, Lord Byron. Lord Byron, the idol of literary Europe and America, who arrived in Greece in 1824, only to inspire other romanticists across Europe to join him. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to invite you to a virtual journey that starts with Solomos and Kalvos, goes through the poetry of Lord Byron, crosses the memoirs of Makrygiannis, and arrives to the modern Greek poetry of today. And before saying, enjoy this seminar, allow me to give you a piece of advice. Ladies and gentlemen, learn Greek to improve your English. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now I will give the floor to our moderator, Professor of Discourse Analysis and Sociolinguistics at King's College London, Alexandra Georgakopoulou, to introduce the panelists.
Καλησπέρα σε όλες και όλους. Είναι μεγάλη τιμή και χαρά μου που μετέχω σε αυτή την δικαίως εορταστική εκδήλωση, έστω και σε χαλεπούς καιρούς. Thank you so very much for inviting me to this event. In these tricky times, I would like in turn to extend a very warm welcome to all of you in this virtual setting. I have the highly pleasurable task of introducing our 3 distinguished speakers, 2 of whom I was privileged to have as my colleagues for a number of years at King's College London. I'm referring to Professor Roderick Beaton and Professor David Ricks. So let me very briefly introduce our speakers in the order in which they will present. Professor Roderick Beaton, now Emeritus Koreis Professor, did the post of Koreis Professor justice for 3 decades, 1988 to 2018, at King's College London, of a highly prolific and field-shaping research publications record. I'm only singling out here his 2 recent books, Byron's War, Romantic Rebellion, Greek Revolution, 2015, and Greece, Biography of a Modern Nation, 2019, now a Penguin paperback. Both have been published in Greek translation. After Professor Beaton's presentation, we will hear from Dr. Io Manolessu, Acting Director of the Research Center for Modern Greek Dialects of the Academy of Athens. Dr. Manolessu has numerous publications in the history of the Greek language and dialects, including the Cretan and the Asia Minor language varieties. The latest research project she has been involved in is the digitizing of the Cappadocian dialectal landscape, and she has very strong links with modern Greek studies in the UK, as her latest co-authored book, 2019, The Cambridge Grammar of Medieval and Early Modern Greek, attests to. Last but not least, Professor David Ricks, Emeritus Professor, who also taught at King's College London from 1989 to until last year. Currently the editor of Byzantine and Modern Greek Studies. Professor David Ricks has produced compellingly original studies of numerous Greek poets such as Solomos, Kalvos, Kavafi, Sinopoulos, and so on, and has also published about modern Greek poetry in its relations to classical tradition. So without further ado, I'm giving the floor, metaphorically speaking, in this medium to our speakers. We will watch, because that's what we will do, the 3 presentations consecutively, and afterwards our speakers will answer questions. So you're welcome to start posting your questions as soon as you have them, please, in the Q&A box. Thank you very much.
Mr. Deputy Minister, Ambassador, friends, and everyone out there watching, it's a great pleasure to take part in this celebration of International Greek Language Day and to kick off this discussion about different aspects of the Greek language in relation to the Greek Revolution. And my subject now is Byron, Solomos, Kalvos, poets of the Greek Revolution. A revolution needed a new language. Byron's famous verses that begin "the Isles of Greece, the Isles of Greece" have often been quoted out of context. In fact, they're usually quoted out of context. And they've been understood as a simple call to arms to liberate the enslaved Greeks in 1821. In fact, Byron's lines were written 2 years before the outbreak of the revolution in 1819. And in their context, in a comic epic poem called Don Juan, these lines are actually presented as a poetic experiment. If the Greeks were to rise up against their Ottoman masters, this is how their poets might celebrate their resolve in verse. And Byron continues, "Thus sung or would or could or should have sung the modern Greek in tolerable verse." Far less often quoted than the resounding line, "I dreamed that Greece might still be free," is Byron's meditation that immediately follows. This is on the power of language to revolutionize the way that people think. But words are things, and a small drop of ink, falling like dew upon a thought, produces that which makes thousands, perhaps millions, think. For Byron himself as a poet, that new language turned out to be, paradoxically, silence. Or rather, the decision to give up poetry altogether. Once Byron had made that fateful commitment in 1823 to give his fortune and the best efforts of his life to the cause of the Greek Revolution. And in his last year, before he died in Thessaloniki in 1824, Byron transformed himself systematically from a man of words into a man of action. His last months, in fact, were filled with pragmatic decision-making and planning to determine how best he could work with the provisional government of independent Greece to achieve the political goals of the revolution. And that, I think, is what Byron meant in the last poem that he ever completed on his 36th birthday on 22nd January 1824. He wrote, "Awake, not Greece, she is awake. Awake my spirit. Think through whom thy lifeblood tracks its parent lake, and then strike home." That poem is often read as Byron's fatalistic farewell to life. I believe it's a farewell to the youthful self, the poet, that he is deliberately leaving behind by the act of moving to Missolonghi. And because it's a poem, naturally, it brims with longing for those feelings and those instincts that naturally belong to the poet, but the poet also acknowledges are unworthy of the man of action that he's now becoming. Tread those reviving passions down, unworthy manhood. Unto thee, indifferent should the smile or frown of beauty be. Well, the challenge that Byron had thrown down in Don Juan to a modern Greek poet to create a new revolutionary language worthy of a national struggle, that challenge was taken up shortly afterwards by his younger Greek contemporaries, Andreas Kalvos and Dionysios Solomos, whom the ambassador mentioned in his preface, his prologue. Born in 1792, Kalvos was only 4 years younger than Byron. Solomos in 1798, 10. Both poets came from the Ionian island of Zakynthos, and both, unlike most Greeks at that time, had had the benefit of an education in Italy. It was after the revolution had begun that both Kalvos and Solomos made the life-changing decision to write poetry not in the language of their education, which they had done up till then, but in what was literally their mother tongue, Greek. In this way, and probably quite intentionally, both Kalvos and Solomos aspired to become the national bard for the Greek nation that was then fighting for its existence. Both Kalvos and Solomos wrote poems in which they addressed the abstraction liberty, eleftheria, in personified form. Both, in poems written and published during the 1820s, while the revolution was in progress, depicted events that had recently taken place in different parts of embattled Greece. And both, as is well known, viewed the struggle from a physical and to some extent also an emotional distance that allowed them the luxury of being able to write poetry at all. Solomos was writing in his native Zakynthos, and then from 1828 onwards in Corfu, to which he moved. Both of those places were under British rule at that time, and therefore formally, officially, neutral in the Greek struggle. Kalvos was peripatetic in Europe. He published one book in Geneva and the second in Paris. All of which brings me back to our topic today, which is language. For a Greek poet to celebrate and to urge on the revolutionary actions of his compatriots, it wasn't enough just to write about revolutionary subject matter. Exactly as Byron had predicted, revolutionary poetry required a revolutionary language. Kalvos, far away from his birthplace and with few Greek friends, went on to create an elevated or heightened idiom based on spoken modern Greek, but with many elements borrowed from ancient Greek. Much as the linguistic reformer and political thinker Andreas Kalvos had been urging, also at a distance from Greece in Paris, for the previous 20 years. It's often said that Kalvos wrote in Katharevousa, the artificial hybrid form of Greek that would slowly emerge during the 19th century and in the 20th would become the official language of Greece for half a century. But Kalvos' Greek is not actually Katharevousa. It's like no other that had been written before or that anyone has seriously written ever since. It's all his own. Kalvos' poetic language is a fitting and worthy match for the high moral tone of the 24 odes that he dedicated to the Greek Revolution, that were published in 2 books in 1824 and 1826. Solomos, by contrast, formed his poetic idiom from what he called the language of the people, η γλώσσα του λαού. In fact, Solomos' language is not the local dialect of the Ionian Islands, which he would have heard spoken daily round about him in Zakynthos and later in Corfu. Rather, it's the language of the folk songs that had been collected by some of his friends and would first find their way into print in the 2 volumes published in Paris by the Philhellene Claude Folliel in 1824 and 1825. Appropriately enough, the second of those volumes concludes with Solomos' own hymn to liberty, Ύμνος στην ελευθερία, which had first been published in Messalongi in 1824 and was now, in Folliel's edition, accompanied by a French translation. At least in the eyes of foreign readers, while the revolution in Greece was still at its height, Solomos' hymn was presented as a revolutionary offshoot of the traditional art of oral song. And indeed, it's fair to say that it was that, even although it was written by a highly educated son of an Ionian aristocrat. It's not really possible to convey in English the flavor of these 2 very different, but equally revolutionary for their time, forms of Greek, the one devised by Kalvos, the other by Solomos during the 1820s, and quite specifically as a response to the revolution that was going on in mainland Greece, just across the water. So rather than saying any more about them, I'll end by reading, first in the original Greek and then in translation, a brief extract from the poems that each national bard wrote to lament the death of Lord Byron in 1824. Here is Kalvos. O viron πνεύματον Βρετανίδων, τέκνον μουσών και φίλε άμυρα της Ελλάδος καλή Στεφάνου. O Byron, O heavenly spirit of the British Isles, Muses' child and friend ill-fated to Greece the fair-crowned. And here's Solomos. Λευθεριά για λίγο πάψε να χτυπάς με το σπαθί, τώρα σίμωσε και κλάψε εις του Byron το κορμί. Liberty, cease a while from smiting with thy glaive. Come hither now and weep upon Lord Byron's grave. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I would like first to thank the Greek Embassy for inviting me to this event. It's nice for me to remember again the many years that I've spent in the UK studying and working. Alternating between 2 talks on poetry and literature, my hopefully brief and probably less exciting contribution will be about the linguistic expression of the rebels, the fighters themselves, and more precisely as the type of language that we encounter in warriors' memoirs like Makrygiannis, Kolokotronis, and other less well-known but not less important participants of the revolution. My first observation of the topic is a rather disappointing one. There isn't much scholarly linguistic research targeting this type of texts. This includes both a linguistic description of individual textual sources and the more general coverage and exploitation of the sources of the period by reference works such as dictionaries, grammars, and textual corpora. This seems strange, given the great historical value both of these texts and of the overall period, which was crucial for the formation of the modern Greek state and with it the modern Greek language. However, it's not really unexpected. The reason for this neglect is the usual suspect that we encounter every single time we try to approach the history of the Greek language from the Hellenistic period onwards, the phenomenon of diglossia. Texts we are discussing today, as indeed the most Greek texts written in the 19th century, are typical instances of diglossia. Their linguistic form is distanced from the spoken vernacular of the period, displaying instead, to a greater or smaller extent, archaizing or learned linguistic features belonging to earlier stages of the Greek language. What the non-specialist Greek audience knows as a distinction between Δημοτική and Καθαρέουσα. The type and quantity of these purist features is variable. On one end of the scale, they may be as long dead as the dative case in the infinitive, and on the other, they may be nothing more than an obnoxious final ni tagged onto all nominal and verbal terminations. By definition, however, historical linguistics, in order to approach as closely as possible the mechanism of diachronic language change, needs to target texts that mirror as faithfully as possible a native speaker's natural idiom. It's rather difficult to investigate the evolution of Greek on the basis of Καθαρέουσα texts, except of course in the domain of the vocabulary, but that's another issue. So that's the main reason why there isn't much research about these texts. The Greek diglossic situation has, of course, major social and ideological dimensions, having to do with the construction of a new national identity and a new society in general. And this, on the contrary, has been quite thoroughly investigated by many scholars, including the way it is reflected in the texts of the revolution. But as I said, I'm not going to discuss this today. Going against the current, I would prefer to focus not on the historical, social, or ideological dimension of these texts, but instead on their purely linguistic one. I am going to discuss questions like, I hope it's working. Yes. I'm going to discuss questions like, can we classify the revolutionary memoirs into categories based on their register? Can we see dialectal, geographical, regional features in them? Can we see tendency for the creation of a standard language? The first thing to do for trying to answer this question would be to create a corpus of texts. And trying to do that, one is again struck by the paradox that there is much work on memoirs as a literary genre either, despite the fact that quantitatively the memoir in 19th century Greece is the most productive, prolific literary genre as compared to poetry or historiography or whatever. I've only been able to find one or two works, specifically dedicated to the genre of memoir or autobiography, and one or two chapters in general histories of Greek discussing this genre. Now, on the basis of this preliminary bibliography, we can try to place memoirs along a scale of linguistic purism, let's say, which mostly depends, though not always, on the degree of education of the writer. I've gathered about 40 works. One could perhaps include a few more, depending on the criterion one chooses to classify something as a rebel's memoir or the accessibility of the sources. At the higher end of the scale, we find texts mostly written by persons possessing a high social position, members of the old and privileged classes, members of the church, and who constantly have good education. Παλαιόν πατρών Γερμανός is an example, Georgios Psyllas, Konstantinos Metaxas, Christoforos Panagis, some others. Here we can find the datives and the infinitives that I mentioned earlier, as well as the full range of ancient nominal and verbal morphology. But even these texts cannot be said to ascend to the heights of archaism one encounters in some literary authors. Their structure is paratactic, and they cannot avoid innovative vocabulary or loanwords. Here is an example from Παλαιόν πατρών Γερμανός. Ανήγγυλον αμέσως της οπλαρχηγής τα δριατάξαντα, παραγγέλων αυτής την αμυγινηθώση των θεσεόντων, ικανοί όντες να αντικρούσουμεν η ανδήποτε προσβολήν των Τούρκων. And so on. And another one from Psyllas. Παραλαμβάνουμε κατά μέρος, διέλεγεν ότι αν το εδίδε το εις Σαλαμής και η Μεγαρής, δια 5 έτη υπό την απόλυτον κυριαρχίαν του, υπέσχετο να εκδιώξει τον Κιταχήν από τας Αθήνας. Τότε εγώ του ανέμνησα την συμβουλή την οποία το έδωκα καταρχάς, να καταλάβει την μονή της φανερωμένης. Moving on to next lower level, this is constituted by authors who have acquired some schooling in letters, mostly through their professional service in the army, such as Kasomoulis, Fotakos, Makrygiannis, Kolokotronis, Makrygiannis. The Kasomoulis register with its conservative nominal and verbal inflection is still there, but at least most of the datives are gone, and the style is much more reminiscent of spoken language. So sometimes there are grammatical and syntactical errors in the use both of the high and the low style, and interspersed vernacular anecdotes. Here's an example from Kasomoulis. Με τα σπαθιά στα χέρια κυνηγώντας τους χτυπήσαμεν, τους διαλύσαμεν και τους εμβάσαμεν στην χώραν κακήν κακός. Κυνηγώντες αυτούς επιστρέψαμεν χωρίς να θέλομεν πάλι στα ίδια. And at the end, η Μαριγό δυστυχισμένη, ως αθώα κι αυτή, ευγήκεν με υποδέχτια φρισμένων, βραχνιασμένων από τις φωνές, λέγει τότες, τώρα είσαι το όντι ερωτόκριτος, διότι είσαι και νικητής. An example from Dionys Βοαφόπουλος from Ιθάκη. Ο Μερβριώνης έφτασε τριαμβεύοντας έως τας Αθήνας. Τότε βρέθημεν στην ανάγκη να υπάγουμε να πιάσουμε τα βερβένια και φωνάζαμεν όσοι πιστοί, αλλά οι στρατιώτε έβλεπαν την Τριπολιτσά πλησιάζοντας τη θέση, δεν ήθελε κανείς διανακοινηθεί. Ο γέρον Κολοκοτρώνης και όλοι όσοι είχαμε ανθρώπους τους υποσχόμεθα να πάρουν 2 μερίδια οι στρατιώτε όσοι φυλανέλες στα Δερβένια ή όσοι δεν μείνουν στη Τριπολιτσά 1. Κατά αυτόν τον τρόπο συνάπτηκαν αρκετοί για τα Δερβένια. Going even lower, we find texts which, although touched up somehow in the manner described at the start of my talk, with final and here and there, some archaic sounding inflection of endings, they are basically vernacular texts, teeming with innovative Greek and loan vocabulary. To this category belong memoirs of Skouzes, Panagis, Skouzes, Andreas Kalvos, Panagis, Sachtouris, and others. Here's an example from the Athenian Panagis Skouzes, χρονικό της κλαβωμένης Αθήνας. Ήρθαν στην Τσιφισιά. You see here the typical for the old Athenian dialect phenomenon of τσιταγισμός, Τσιφισιά instead of Τσιφισιά. Ένα μέρος κατέβηκε στο Μαρούσι Χαλάντρι και είχαν απόφαση να εισβάλλουν στην πόλη για ανοιχτός. Οι Τούρκοι έβαλαν όλες τις φαμελιές τους στην Ακρόπολη, τα γυναικόπαιδά τους. Οι χριστιανοί έστειλαν τη Σαλαμίνα και Αίγαινα, μη χωρώντας η Ακρόπολη όλες τις φαμελιές. And another one, rather touching, from a sailor, Sachtouris, of Hydra, full of naval vocabulary. Ημερολόγιον θαλασσινό. Εξημερώθηκαν ανοιχτά της Αρκαδίας, 25 μίλια, με Πουνέντε Μαΐστρο. Πήραμε τη βόλτα και επισκέφθηκαμε 2 Ιωνικά, τα οποία μας είπαν ότι το Μεσολόγιο αντέχει, ότι ο εχθρικός στόλος στέκεται εκεί πολιορκώντας τον, ότι ζήτησαν οι εχθροί να κάνουν 3 φορές έφοδο στο βασιλάδι και ότι το τείχος διατηρείται, αλλά πικρούστησαν με βλάβητο. Ορτσάρωμεν ολοένα κατά την Ζάκυνθον, ο άνεμος Μαΐστρος δυνατότατος. Το σπέρας σύννεφα στους κρόφες. 5η 16 Ιουλίου, εξημερώθηκαν με τον ίδιο καιρό Μαΐστρο Τραμουντάνα Σοταβέντο, την έμος της Ακίνθου. Απόψε στα 3 την νυχτός ελάβουμε με ταχύτητα γράμματα από Ζάκυνθο δυτικά, τότε το Μεσολόγγι πνέει τα ολίσθια και να προφτάσουμε. And at the very bottom of the scale, we have authors who are totally illiterate, totally devoid of education, and consequently very close to spoken language, full of dialectal features. Very few texts fit into this category. The memoirs of Makrygiannis, written by himself in his old age after having barely conquered literacy, and the memoirs of the illiterate Kolokotronis, Makrygiannis, and Timotheus, dictated to Georgios Tertzetis. Here it is indeed possible to come close to vernacular speech with minimal influence from the learned language. Total elimination of learned features is of course impossible because literacy, by definition, brings about a degree of normalization and elements from high registers. And from a different viewpoint, one may sometimes wonder whether some of the features, vernacular features we see in the texts, are due to the intermediary thanks to whom these texts have come to us. In the case of Makrygiannis, the editor Vlachogiannis, and in the case of Kolokotronis, the hand of Tertzetis. But when we see in the text elements of the local dialect of the author, dialect of Roumelin in the case of Makrygiannis, and of the dialect of Peloponnese in the case of Kolokotronis, that makes us more certain that we're really hearing their voice. Here, for example, is an extract from Makrygiannis. Την Αθήνα δεν τυχαίται και να λιμουριαχτεί δεν αφήνω εγώ. The verb is limuriazo. I'm very hungry from limura, but prophetica is really characteristic of northern dialects of Sterea Ελλάδα and Thessaly. Further down, μέσα στον κάβο φτιάναμε τα μπούρια και κολυμπούγαμε νύχτα και μέρα ανάμεσα των Τούρκων τα πόστα. Κολυμπούγαμε this verbal ending for the conjugation of verbs now is characteristic of Rumeli, and lower down also characteristic is a word like Athenegi with intervening semi-vowel between vowels of Athenegi. And finally, here is an extract from Giaros Moria with his Peloponnesian Μακαβαλίκο instead of Μακαβαλίσο. Μακαβαλίκο να πάω στην Κόρφο, στην Κόρινθο. The Carterae without γάμα instead of the Carterae, and some dialect and adverbs like totenes. I would have really liked to run a commentary for each of the rebels extract in more detail, but unfortunately there's no time to do that, so we'll just have to do this small taste. But if anyone feels like it, one can easily find most of these texts freely on the internet in their original 19th century editions. You would have expected a concerted effort on the part of the Greek state to provide new authoritative online editions for the benefit of the public, but this hasn't happened yet. Still, the old ones are there. With a little bit of searching, one can find them, and really, perhaps, we should make that little bit of effort to hear the rebels' real voices on this big anniversary. Thank you.
Good. My talk is on the topic modern Greek poetry encountering a great tradition. And of course, I've encountered it as someone who isn't Greek and has come to this with great pleasure from outside. Now, Roderick Beaton's just reminded us, as few others have that authority to do, that the Greek Revolution in poetry was articulated in more than one language, at a time when one of those languages, Greek in its modern phase, was still just starting to find a European audience through bilingual editions such as that of Claude Fauriel's Chant Populaire, and so on. I'm going to take up the story when the poetry of the modern nation had really started to get into its stride. And that, here I'm generalizing and simplifying, that had meant shaking off katharevousa as an idiom to write poetry in. And that process was consolidated from the 1880s onward. There were lots of good reasons to learn Greek, as we heard in the charming video at the start, but one of the very best is to encounter the poetry of the Greeks of today and of the relatively recent past, not just the ancient Greeks, though that's well worth doing too. Let me start with a quotation from an eminent Hellenist, one long a professor at Oxford and then Chicago, and late in life, Minister of Culture in Greece, the late C.A. Tripanis. He ended his rather old-fashioned 1981 book, Greek Poetry from Homer to Seferis, with the statement, unsurprising because true, that poetry written in Greek constitutes the longest uninterrupted literary tradition of the Western world. Okay, and then Tripanis made a more striking claim. I quote, "Better poetry has been written in Greek in the last century," by which he means since 1880, "than in the 14 centuries that preceded it." Now that's a controversial statement worth thinking about. Coming up to date, a recent interview, a COVID-era interview with Greece's best poet critic of today, Nasos Vaginas, featured the strong and justifiably proud assertion that of the poets who've written in modern Greek, 10 are of European stature. Because people like lists, I'd better say who these poets are, in Vaganas's opinion. Well, 2 of these poets long predate the time when Greece was a nation state. Georgios Chortatsis and Vincentos Kornaros, both from Crete under Venetian rule, but now, of course, part of the heritage of all Greeks. And we saw that rather nice examples, quoting or mentioning Herodotos in Kasomoulis' memoirs. So we've got Chortatsis, Kornaros. Then, of course, we'd expect to find on Vaganas's list Kalvos and Solomos, about whom we were hearing earlier. And then Vaganas gives us the following half-dozen names: Palamas, Kavafi, Sikeliaros, Seferis, Elitis, Ritsos. These are big names, big personalities, and substantial oeuvre. Really getting to know even this half-dozen poets is the work of a lifetime. And yet there are ways which can really encourage the learner of modern Greek as she starts out, and also give her a sense of what ideas of Greekness and what experience of often very testing phases of history are explored and contested in this great poetic tradition. So I'll briefly touch on the names broadly in chronological order of birth, and if it comes across as a bit like TripAdvisor ratings, then perhaps that's unavoidable. So to start with, Kostis Palamas, born in Patras, brought up across the Corinthian Gulf in the hallowed town of Missolonghi. He came from a family originally called Palamaris, which upgraded its name to suggest a connection with the theologian St. Gregory Palamas. He's the only one on Vaganas's list who could uncomplicated be called the Greek national poet or poet laureate while he lived. He wrote a huge amount, including in forms that modern readers find rather hard to respond to, like epic, and he is very uneven. Translations of his poetry, and of course these are such a help to the beginner and intermediate learner, especially when you've got the translation on the opposite page from the original. Translations of Palamas's poetry are both old-fashioned and rather hard to get hold of. Yet when in quieter mood, Palamas's short poems are in admirably clear Greek, which still has the capacity to range across the wide cultural memory of the Greek people, and above all, its poetry. And just to pick out one collection, his satirical exercises from 1912 still pack a real punch as protest poems, appealing to readers at times of doubt and anger in the political field, times such as Greece has recently lived through because of the terrible economic crisis from which it's now emerging. You wouldn't, as a language learner, start with Palamas, as used to be the case in the old days, but he still has a great deal to offer. C.P. Kavafi, he was always careful to call himself that, not Kavapi Kavafis, would have disputed that point. He built much of his career on not being Palamas. And he brings different things from the Greek table and to the Greek table in family background and poetically. Here there's a poet with a birth and nearly lifelong residence in Alexandria, a Constantinopolitan family background, a partly English upbringing. You can see where he lived near Queensway. And Kavafi, though the proud holder of a Greek passport, represents the Greeks of the wider world, and his fluency in English and French helped him become what he now is, the Greek poet of the modern era, most widely read around the world. I think of all Greek poets, only Homer and Sophocles are more widely read, and no modern poet from any country has seen his collected poems translated into English as often as Kavafi has. Kavafi's irony gives him strong appeal today, and his brevity makes him a natural, user-friendly place to begin a study of modern Greek poetry. He also embraces so much of the experience of the Greeks over the centuries that you can use him as a sort of substitute for lengthy historical works like those of Konstantinos Papadopoulos. Kavafi's Greek is not as non-standard as many people claim, and so often is he quoted in newspapers, political debate, and daily discourse that you could say he's an essential element even for a modern Greek phrasebook. There are people, and I've met them, who decided to learn modern Greek simply because they had to read Kavafi in Greek. Kavafi's only possible equal in his lifetime, I think, was Angelos Sikelianos. This is a very different kind of Greek background from the rich tapestry of an old people. We're back in the Ionian Islands from a family earlier called Tsitsilianos, and we're talking about someone with a good knowledge of Italian. Born in Lefkada in 1884, Sikelianos fervently believed that Lefkada, not Fiaki, was the Homeric Ithaca, just as some have said it is true of Kefalonia. I don't want to get into all that now. Sikelianos is both very demanding and devilishly hard to translate, unless you're the brilliant American poet A.E. Stallings, who lives in Athens and whose work is full of Greek reference. Sikelianos writes in a range of complex forms, alludes to a bewildering variety of myths in a very eccentric way, and has a very wide vocabulary ranging from ancient words to modern dialect forms. But he is, among other things, Greece's great modern poet of place. So to read his short poems with attention is also to think about what the great sites of Greece really mean, whether they're ancient ones like Olympia or Byzantine like Osios Lukas. Then we've got on Vagianas's list still George Seferis, born Georgios Seferiadis near Smyrna in 1900, moving to Greece in 1914 during one of many periods of persecution for Near Eastern Christians. Seferis always felt a little bit of an outsider in the Greek state, though he was its distinguished public servant. He might have become a French poet, and a good one. Instead, he became a truly European poet, whose work was available in book form from 1947 in English, before Kavafi's was actually, and who for so many readers abroad has represented the voice of Greece itself, as his Nobel Prize came to recognize. Reading Seferis, often with Keeley and Sherrod's versions on the opposite page, was very often the first encounter of the foreign reader with the modern Greek tradition. In an age less patient about elusiveness in poetry, and often a bit hostile to a straw man of literary modernism, Seferis' excellent poetry is perhaps less likely to be a first point for readers to enter today. Greece's other Nobel Prize winner was, of course, Odysseas Elitis, born in 1911 as Alepoudelis, a wealthy Lesbos family in Iraklio, Crete, 2 years before the island was integrated with Greece. Here I'm going to dissent a little bit from received opinion and perhaps give a lower rating on TripAdvisor. In my view, Elitis was a poet with some fine contributions, but perhaps only one really good volume. If I was writing it in a TripAdvisor idiom, I might say that I preferred the small plates to the main dishes. But anyway, he had a great bulk and complexity of oeuvre, but also what a poet in Greece hostile to Elitis called a tendency to create contraptions. I've sometimes thought it was a pity that Elitis won the Nobel Prize because it's made the Greeks less grateful than they should be for some of the other poets of roughly the same vintage who were extremely good too, and good in different ways. Take Elitis' friend Andreas Kalvos, who still speaks out loud and bold, including on YouTube. Take Takis Sinopoulos, whose Necrothipnos is the best book of poems since World War II, I think. And then going back a little while, we've got Kariutakis, who died in 1928 by his own hand. He's perhaps more accessible than any of the poets I've just grouped together, and his elegies and satires is a book with plenty of the humour that, I think we should admit it, does help with language learning and isn't always to the fore when we're studying poetry. Well, I've given a little bit of a list there, and part of the problem, and I'm going to stop myself, is that there are so many modern Greek poets of merit that once you start, it's hard to restrain yourself. But I'm going to end with the last poet mentioned on Vagianas's list, That's Yannis Ritsos. And Ritsos jokes in one of his poems about how his name is easy to pronounce, even for foreigners, of course. Ritsos, born in 1909 from Monimvasia in the southern Peloponnese. You'll have noticed that not one of the poets on Vaganas's list, and of course Vaganas himself too is Raminos from Drama, not one of the poets on this A list of Vaganas is an Athenian born and bred. That tells you something about the different strengths that the Greek people derive from their regional heritages. Well, like Palamas and Sikelianos, Ritsos can be daunting to the reader, any reader, just because of the sheer size of his poetic production. In fact, only the former British ambassador to Athens, Dr. John Kittmer, has probably read the whole of it. But Ritsos has a superabundance of short poems, typically under 1 page long, which reflect what he calls in the title of one such poem, the meaning of simplicity. He'd read all of the poets we've mentioned above, but his debts to them are generally unobtrusive. His poems are about ordinary people, ordinary Greeks, mostly, yet with constant surprises because he doesn't look down on ordinary people. They reflect Greek nature and life in their many facets. They don't shy away from the tribulations of the Greeks, seen from a distinctive political point of view. And they speak to us in a register of Greek that in Ritsos' maturity doesn't draw attention to itself, and which, though the poet has been dead now for more than 30 years, doesn't seem to me at all dated today. No surprise then that so many translations or reworkings of Ritsos poetry in English and other languages work very well. I think if I was starting intermediate students of the modern Greek language on poetry, I'd probably begin with Ritsos and work back from him. Someone said of Thomas Hardy's poetry, there's always another Hardy poem, and so it is with Ritsos. Well, the Greeks are lucky with their poets. You Greeks are very lucky with your poets, and anyone who learns enough of the modern language to read in them is lucky too. Thank you.
Well, we have been treated to snapshots of the richness, historicity, and localization of language registers, resources, and key voices in the Greek language, some in their connections with the Greek Revolution. And I would like to thank our speakers very, very much for this album of forms and sounds and their apt reminders of the historicized multiplicity of the Greek language. I very much hope that there's lots of questions which you can ask by raising your hand or using the Q&A box. And there is one already from Christos Psaltis, a question to Professor Rix. I'm sure David can see this as well. You spoke of Kariotakis' sense of humor. Did Theodorakis kill Seferis' humor so far as Greek poetry readers are concerned? An intriguing question for you, David. David, if you could unmute.
Yep. Sorry. Certainly, Seferis, it's a sharp and interesting question. I think Seferis' sense of humor was pronounced, and it's something which perhaps in overall presentations of his work, whether in musical settings or academic discussions, doesn't always come out. This sort of broad humor you get some of the time. Some of it's perhaps not very, would be deemed a bit off color by today's standards, but that's certainly a reminder that Seferis is a multifarious poet with sharp tendencies to irony and critique, and when he's dressing down, so to speak, an ability to include quite broad humor. So thank you for that reminder. Perhaps as a footnote, I would add great poet as he is, there was not a single ounce of humor in the whole of the work of Angelos Sikelianos. And that's something that Seferis joked about a bit in his novel Exinichtes στην Ακρόπολη.
Great. On this note, we've got 2 raised hands from Andreas Stavropoulos Maragno and Christine Kenyon-Jones. So if we could start, and a third one. So if we could start with Andreas Stavropoulos, please. Your question. Okay, so that wasn't, okay, sorry. Rhea's telling us that this was a mistake, not a question. We've got, let's see if we've got another raised hand. No. Oh, George Lemos, please. Question. No. Is there a question there? Maybe not. I see raised hands which are not raised for long, so maybe mistakes there. We've got a question for Dr. Manolescu from Dr. Leah Chizakov. Do you think an anthology of the most prominent memoirs of the Greek Revolution should be published in an English translation?
Well, I did say at the very end of my talk that the real voice of the rebels deserves to be heard on this, our big anniversary. This is true first for Greece. I mean, we should have new editions, maybe online editions accessible to all. But I don't know if there are any English translations of the memoirs. It's something that I really don't know. If there aren't, I believe that in general, independently of the event, for the uses of teaching Greek history, there should be something to help someone interested in the subject if they don't have Greek, if they don't know Greek. I think yes, so my answer would be positive. How could it be negative? It would be a good idea to have an anthology.
Can I just come in at this point? That as far as the only one I can think of is there's quite an old abridged translation of Makrygiannis' memoirs. It goes back to the 1970s, I think. I doubt if it's still in print. But I mean, I don't think any. I mean, there's that series of 20 or more volumes, the Aponi Monevatai Memoirs of Combatants, which can contain an amazing wealth of material, and they haven't been translated. And although, I mean, a lot of people, everybody quotes Kasomoulis, but sometimes even in biographies of Byron, for example, but he's pretty inaccessible. There's only the original 1930, 1937 and 38 edition. So there is you're absolutely right, Io, there is a gap there.
One of the hands has now, which was raised and then lowered, has now materialized in a question in the Q&A box from Andreas Stavropoulos Maragno. what is it, a big question, what is it about, but I was hoping we'd have this question, about the Greek language that lends itself so well to poetry? How long have we got? Or could we attempt a brief answer? Could we attempt one?
I would nominate David Ricks for that one.
I think so.
Well, I'm not so sure about that, but I think one key thing is that if you're looking at, in the modern period, the top tier of poets, they don't all have a high degree of formal education in different periods of Greek. So Kavafi didn't, for example, Ritos didn't really, but they're all receptive to the fact that the Greek language is a very ancient one and that it represents a sort of spectrum you can move along. I mean, probably, so it's a great rich resource. I would add actually in this context that it's not just true of poetry, but prose. And so if we look at the huge and sort of disorderly work of Alexandros Papadiamandis and his novels, and of course more so his short stories, there's someone who, as Palamas said, really had the Yera Elinika. He really had this sort of deep conversance with all kinds of Greek through the centuries, and that enriches his work and makes him very hard to translate, I think. So perhaps, I mean, my footnote there would be to say, I suppose, brought out very well by Dr. Manolescu in talking about these important memoir writers, is that Greece is not just the land of poetry, but actually there's a huge amount of pesographia, prose writing of different kinds, which also deserves attention, perhaps sometimes can be a bit unfairly squeezed out.
There's another, thank you, David. There's another one for you, but let me take this one, which is for Professor Beaton, Roddy, I think, from Kostas Evangelidis. How significant is Byron's influence on Greek poetry? Now that should be up your street.
It absolutely is, yes. And I mean, my colleague, I think now Jorgen Dar, has written about a book and a half, I think, on this subject, in which he really argues that there is a kind of Byron mania that runs as an undercurrent through Greek poetry, at least in the 19th century. Though I think it rather disappears in the 20th century. But then in the 20th century, poets tend to be on a different wavelength from the Romantics anyway. Despite which, I mean, somewhat flippantly, and despite the poems I read myself earlier, which are directly addressed to Byron, the kind of short answer is actually not very much. You know, I think there's particular aspects of Byron that resonate in Greece and certainly in the Greek poetic imagination. Byron, the Philhellene, self-sacrifice, you know, the fact that he traveled in Greece and wrote about Greece. But Byron's actually rather complicated poetics. I think perhaps I can't think of a single Greek poet who actually engages closely either with the Byron of Childe Harold and their other swashbuckling Oriental tales, as they're called, or of the late comic masterpiece Don Juan, which actually outside the English-speaking world, I think is much less well known anyway. You know, the classic example is well, I mentioned the Isles of Greece. It's always taken out of context. They're actually part of a comic poem. But I can't think, David might correct me on this, I can't think of a Greek poet who really engages with that. I mean, it's a kind of 18th century humor, or some would say a postmodern humor that you get in Byron's Don Juan. And I can't really see that anywhere in the Greek poetic tradition.
I'm inclined to agree, actually, and I'll just add, again, speaking for prose writers, I think the most authentically Byronic or post-Don Juan writer in Greece, who quotes Byron at the top of one of the chapters of his Pope Joan, is Roidis, so that there's a sort of paradox there that Roidis is the most postmodern, sort of post-Byronic one, but he isn't a poet, and he's striving for comic effects, I think in a quite Byronic way at times.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. Thank you.
We've got another 5 minutes. I'll take one question, as I said, for you, David, which is a recommendation. British citizen living in Greece, learning the Greek language with the aim of acquiring citizenship. Which poet would you recommend? Would David Ricks recommend to start with reading and learning the richness of the language? It's a nice one.
Well, I mean, as I was saying at the end, I think there's a good case for going to Rictos first. The poems, they're the most modern ones of these sort of big old dead poets. Some of them are very long, okay, but a lot of them are very short. The Greek tends to be somewhat more simple and allowing for taste, because, you know, it's different strokes for different folks. I think Rictos is a really excellent place to begin thinking about the emotional resonances of Greek and, as I was saying, the lives of ordinary people and so on. So, I mean, just as a parenthesis, I'd add that I think some younger people are put off Rictos by the fact that they think he represents a totally obsolete political credo and allegiance to, you know, communism right through his life. But I think people probably need to see past that to see the other things that are in his work, actually. So I think I'll go for Rictos. I certainly wouldn't, much as I admire, for example, Sikelianos, suggest language learners go anywhere near him.
Yes, I think good recommendation, I would say. This is an evocative question from Professor Nicholas Mazarakis in Greek. I will read it in Greek and then I'll attempt a translation because it's a πατρίδα του ηλίου η Ελλάδα ελίτης, from ελίτης. Το νόημα πίσω από την ποίηση και την ελευθερία. So what's the meaning, the way I read it, behind poetry and freedom? Suppose one way of connecting a language with the main topic of this event.
Yeah, it looks, I think we're perhaps, I've just seen it on the screen, we're all a little bit stumped by that one, I think. I mean, I'm not quite sure where the questioner is, which way the questioner is sort of looking to take this, but the line that he quotes, Πατρίδα του ήλιου η Ελλάδα, I mean, it kind of picks up that element of elitist poetry, which is often associated with the tourist posters of the Metaxas regime in the 1930s, you know, that Greece is the land of sun and purity, and some of which I think doesn't actually read very well in today's perhaps more pluralist age. So I just think, looking at that quotation, it reminds me of David's reservation about elites, which I must say I thought was actually spot on. I'm rather with you there, David.
Let's move. Let's take a couple of other questions that we've got quickly. I can see from Honda van Steen, current Koreis professor at King's. Which of the modern Greek poets are currently most in need of an English translation? This will be a different priority list for each speaker, preempting different responses.
well, just while the others are thinking, I mean, as David said, I mean, the obvious one has been translated too often already, which is rather a shame for those who like translating poetry. But you know, Cavafy, there really are too many translations already. I mean, okay, just let me throw this in. I mean, there is one, or David mentioned it, there's one translation of Sachtouris which has kind of authoritative standard status by Kilian Sherrard. And I exactly fit David's description as someone who partly learned Greek, reading the Kilian Sherrard translation you know, alongside in the original bilingual edition of 1967. But you know, quite recently there was the new poems of Sachtouris, the Poemata, the complete published poems. It includes the last volume, which was not included until I think the 2014 edition, and most of these have never been translated. And it's just possible, you know, now that the era of Kilian Sherrard, you know, at least one generation has passed since then. I'd like to see a new complete Sachtouris.
I would agree with that, and I think I will at this point say Sikelianos really deserves. No one's going to translate the whole of it, but he really deserves a proper translation. A.E. Stallings, whom I mentioned before, has done a couple of poems very beautifully, and needless to say, I've been urging her to do more, but she's got other fish to fry, including writing her own poems. But I think Sikelianos does deserve to be translated more, and perhaps again, an anthology of Greek symbolists would be nice. There's some very good poets, none of whom we've had time to mention today, who I think could work quite well in translation, sort of selectively give the English-speaking reader a taste of other streams of Greek poetry, which are less prominent, but still very, very accomplished, and which still have some readers today. So there's a lot out there, and translators should take courage and you know, have a go.
Io, anything to add to this?
Well, it's a little out of my league, you understand, you know, poetry. But, well, really, if asked, I would say, shouldn't we try to translate or talk a little bit about more modern Greek poets, like, I don't know, Kiki Dimula, Angelaki Rouk, and women poets, actually. There wasn't a single one mentioned. Personally, I like Katerina Go, for example. Why not a translation of this kind of poetry to show what modern Greece is like? I don't know, what do you think?
I think we have a great now spread of suggestions, but I also think that we have kind of come to the end of this. We're beginning to overrun right now, so apologies to those couple of hands and questions in the Q&A box that we have not managed to go through. Thank you so much, all three of you. And is it Elena's turn from the embassy now?
So this concludes our event. I believe we had some very interesting presentations and a very interesting discussion. So thank you all for joining us and have a pleasant evening.